Welcome to The Buck Stops Here, the official audio show of NotInHallOfFame.com, and I'm your host, Kirk Buckner. The Buck, the owner and the operator of NotInHallOfFame.com and the sister sites, the fictitious Athlete Hall, the fictitious Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I had a chance today to speak with Jack Silverstein, and Jack is a Chicago-based sports historian and someone who I've gotten to know a little bit in the last few months. If you're a regular listener of ours, you probably noticed that we did our own mock Football Hall of Fame committee, and Jack was a big part of that. And I really enjoyed hearing about his insight on that and following him on Twitter. And we had a long conversation about George Halas, Michael Jordan, Chicago Bulls, and just his fandom in particular. And I think it's a great conversation. Of course, I'm a little biased. I was part of it. And I think you'll really enjoy listening to everything that Jack has to say. Jack, I'm really excited about this. I've been a fan of yours ever since we first connected as part of our football group that we do when we're sort of coming up with who we think as an independent group should be in the Football Hall of Fame. I've really enjoyed your input, and you are a historian. And I love talking to people who've really taken the time to do a much deeper dive than I've been able to do in the world of sports. How did you first get into just really taking your fandom to a whole new level?
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. That was really lovely, and I really enjoyed getting to know you. I'm glad that Vinny invited me to join the group, and it's a really cool group, and it's been a great process. I'm excited what you're doing independent of that. So I've always, I think like everybody, I've always been a sports fan. Sports fandom came from my family. It came from the city. I grew up in Evanston, just north of Chicago, so it came from the greater Chicagoland area. It came from what teams were doing. We moved. My parents are from the area, but they met out east, and we moved back here when I was 3 in '84, which was the year that the Bears went to the NFC title before going to the Super Bowl. Obviously, It was the year that the Cubs went back to the playoffs for the first time since 1945. It was the year after the White Sox had their winning ugly season. The Blackhawks weren't hot, but they were still in their run of consecutive postseason streaks. And, of course, it was the year that the Bulls drafted MJ. So I came in to, I returned to the Chicagoland area at a pretty fortuitous time, I guess, to be a sports fan. Or maybe the opposite's true. All the hype and all the excitement was what was going to drive me to be a sports fan, independent of what my parents and grandparents gave me, aunts and uncles, etc. The way that I became a sports historian is I've always loved history. I've always loved lists and reading and newspapers. And at a certain point, to be quite frank, at a certain point at my journalism career, and I started to see that I wanted to focus in on history, and I started to realize that calling myself Chicago's sports historian or calling myself a sports historian, it had a good ring to it. It put my work in a box for people. And that was something my father always said. You have to put yourself in a box so that people can understand what you are and what you do. And then you can put yourself into several boxes. You don't have to confine yourself to one, but you have to kind of find ways to categorize yourself for people and helps them understand your work. And so I thought that was a good one to do, sports historian. I like the sound of that. It then also created a higher standard for myself because then I had to meet that expectation, which I liked because I was already primed to do that. So that, I kind of made sure that focus was there for the reader, which meant it had to be there for me. And it was just also good branding. People started to know, like, you're the sports historian. And then that's like the thing. It doesn't mean I can't do other things or I can't write about current sports, but it just created some context around myself and created a way that people understood what I do in a way that was different than what other great sports writers do. And it's not to say that only people who call themselves sports historians can write about history. There are some awesome fellow historians at Windy City Gridiron. You don't even have to call yourself a historian to be a historian, but it just made sense for all those reasons for me to take that approach.
Mm-hmm. Now, your focus has been, at least from what I've seen, and I could be totally mistaken on this, is in the Chicago area. So I've been reading a lot of your work on George Halas, which has totally rethought the way I looked at him. And I think it's not, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, it's not that you're necessarily trying to paint him in a negative light, but you're trying to put more context on some of the decisions he made in the past. Is that more accurate, or am I mistaken on that?
No, that's accurate. I don't view it as I'm trying to take,
because you're not trying to take him down. You're just sort of like painting a broader picture.
I don't view it as anything other than doing what I always do,
mm-hmm.
which is trying to educate myself, because that is the way that you educate readers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also, I think, the way that you entertain readers, because information is gripping, and something being gripping is entertaining. And new information makes you think about your world in a new way, and that is thrilling.
Right.
And being thrilled is entertaining. So I look at it, and let's talk about what we're talking about. The big piece here is the story that I did late 2019
mm-hmm.
that brought together a current event, which was the Bears wearing these throwback jerseys from 1936 for our 100th season, and my putting the pieces together that 1936 was the third year of the NFL's 12-year ban on black players, and that therefore, short of someone putting it on at some point or something, I mean, in any official capacity, it seemed pretty clear that when the Bears debuted those jerseys in their big celebration in June of 2019, when they had all the fans through and they had all those great panel discussions. I wish I could have gone. I wasn't able to, but it looked really great. And they debuted these jerseys that they would wear in the 2019 season, and the two players who wore them were Kyle Fuller and Tariq Cohen. And so as I put these pieces together, I said, well, those were probably the first two black players to ever wear those jerseys, since they only existed in 1936. George
mm-hmm.
McCaskey had made this big deal about, we selected these jerseys because they're a one-year wonder, and the jerseys look very similar to the jerseys that we wore throughout a good portion of the 1930s, with the exception of these stripes on the shoulders that alternate the Bears' colors, orange and navy,
mm-hmm.
The stripes on each shoulder. And that was the only year that they had those stripes, which is what makes them a one-year wonder jersey. And George McCaskey spent so much time talking about, they only wore them in 36. And boy, Nagurski was there and all that I realized, I knew the 1930s, but I didn't specifically know anything about 36. It wasn't one of the years, earlier in the decade, we'd won some championships. We'd had the undefeated season in 34 and then lost the championship to the Giants. But I didn't know anything about 36 specifically. As I started to read about it, and then at the same time, I knew about the ban, and the NFL had promoted it. It was on their 75 Seasons video, if you remember that came
mm-hmm.
out in 94.
Yeah, I do.
But they didn't talk about it as a defined period. They didn't say 12 years. And they talked about it really in the terms that most white institutions tend to talk about, a period in which they, the white institution, banned black participation. They then talk about it as the black person who broke the color barrier, as if they were just waiting all these years for a black person to be good enough to come along and play the game, and it removes your understanding of the agency. And that's one of the things I'm also interested in as a historian, as a writer, is always being specific. when the ban is just discussed as a free-form, ill-defined blob of time, that's very different than someone saying it was 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I had always heard of Kenny Washington and Woody Strode, and then I feel like I learned about Marion Motley and Bill Willis a little bit afterwards because they were the AAFC and not the NFL. But I'd heard of those guys as the ones who had, quote, broken the color barrier, but I didn't know about Joe Lillard and Ray Kemp, the last two black players in the NFL before the ban, the players who are effectively kicked out of the league. And again, that creates a different understanding of history and of a story and of people's responsibilities and their actions and their legacies. And as I was then reading about all this is where it comes back to George Halas. Again, the NFL told the story. It was always about George Preston Marshall. And George Preston Marshall was one of the founding owners of the Boston Braves. And then his partnership team left. He was a very successful businessman in the DC area. They started this franchise in Boston. His partners left. He changed the name from the Braves to the team name that has now been erased by the Washington football team. And then
actually, before you go further with that, Jack, when I'm reading your articles, just class move on your part because you actually refused to type out that name.
Yeah, I've done that since, at least 2013 when I was at Red Eye, and I didn't make a thing out of it, but we played Washington that year, and I would always say either Washington or D.C., and I did write it in that George Halas piece because it felt appropriate to describe the...
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I just wanted to point that out, but yeah, please continue.
So the point is that the NFL had always told the story as this was the doings of George Preston Marshall, who, as I say, was racist even for the 1930s.
Right.
But George Preston Marshall, he had joined the NFL in 32.
I think so, yeah. That's when the Braves came into existence, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, in 1932. And so it didn't seem plausible to me that this new owner had somehow, without the buy-in of all these power players, gotten this huge ban on black players. And so then I started to think, all right, well, you've got Bert Bell and you've got Curly Lambeau and the Mara family, and you've got George Halas. And George Halas, head of the Rules Committee, a founding member of the National Football League, and was known to always bend the rules for his favor and was looking for competitive edges. Nothing really happened without George Halas signing off or giving the okay, and from what I've read. And so I just started to think, George Halas must have been more involved in this along with these other guys. And this is why I also wrote and I focused in on 8 names. And I looked at all of these power people in the NFL at the time, not just Halas, but I wanted to acknowledge that it seemed realistic to me that George Halas would have been a leader of this by virtue of his standing in the NFL, that he's a leader on everything else. And the year that I put together that this must have started, or the place it must have started, would have been an owners meeting in February of 1933. And it was at that meeting that the league, decided they were going to split the league into divisions to create, better rivalries, more, better experience for the fans. Also, it's better for travel. And they made rules around the forward pass. They redid the field. They put in hash marks for the first time. They were starting to break away from just following the lead of college football in terms of all their rules and formatting and field regulations. And I just felt like if at some point all of a sudden there were no black players, even though there had been a decline since the late 20s, they still had Joe Lillard and Ray Kemp, and then all of a sudden those guys just aren't re-signed. It just felt like that would have been a place where that would have been discussed. And if that were the case, and then I later got confirmation that it was, but if that were the case, that again, if George Halas is running the show on all these other league items, that he would have to have at least been on board with this. And then you go into the 40s, and if part of the argument at the time, as bogus as it is, if part of the argument was, well, the U.S. is in a depression, white fans don't want to see black players, quote-unquote, taking white player jobs, well, by the time, 1940, 1941 came around, the league's fortunes had changed, the country's fortunes to some degree had changed, and yet the ban went on for another 5 years. So I'm thinking now about George Halas, and the number one player in college football in 1939 was Kenny Washington out of UCLA. And then George Halas in the 1970s was asked, why weren't there any black players? And he gave these answers that just didn't seem plausible. He said things like, I don't think it interested them, or they weren't good enough. But, Kenny Washington, obviously, he was the best player in college football by several measures. And there were all these other professional or semi-pro, whatever you want to call them, leagues where black players were playing throughout the ban. And some of those teams and leagues competed against NFL teams, including against the Bears. So there's no way that George Halas would have realistically thought that someone wasn't good enough or that they weren't interested. And George Halas, who, bent his own rules to sign Red Grange, for example,
yes,
and worked around what you were supposed to be allowed to do in terms of signing collegiate players, and signed for I think it was the 1920 championship in the inaugural year. Would look to sign players from other teams just for the championship game, which you weren't supposed to do. So this guy who was always sort of looking for the edge, Kenny Washington, is coming in to the professional pool of players. Why wouldn't he just take Kenny Washington and tell everyone else, all right, I don't care about this ban anymore. We're rolling with Kenny Washington and whoever else, and come and try and stop me. So
to that then,
Jack, as well. So I'm sorry for a long-winded answer, but the point is that I just started to ask questions about the reality of this person who in Chicago and in Illinois, because he went to U of I, and obviously the Bears started in Decatur. I mean, this guy is a myth, a legend, an icon, even more than MJ in a way, not more beloved, but more mythic. Maybe because I was around for MJ and I wasn't around for George Halas, and that's what happens. And maybe MJ will be equally, mythologized. He obviously already is. But I just wanted to sort of fill in the blanks. And the other thing that you always heard about Halas was how, in the words of Elaine Bennis, he was very careful with money. And he angered a lot of people, a lot of Bears, due to his business practices. And you can go right down the line: Bronco Nagurski, Johnny Lujack, Doug Atkins, George Allen, George Blanda, although I think less because of money. He was also angering people because of how he ran his team, and people starting to feel in the 50s and 60s that the game had passed him by. That was what Blanda said. And, pissed off Dick Butkus. So there were all these strands with Halas, and I just wanted and still want to explore them to understand him.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop now.
So as you're looking, no, oh my God, no, that's what I wanted to hear. When you're looking back, so I think we see so much complications in really any figure. It doesn't matter what the field is, whether it's an athlete, an owner, a musician, anything. I always sort of believe that adage that people are onions. There's so many different layers to it. when you look back at Halas for some of the decisions that he could have made but didn't, is that sort of, do you think he just wasn't strong enough, or he just wasn't convicted enough? Because, again, you're not saying that, at least I didn't pick up on this, and if I'm wrong, please tell me. It's not like you're saying, okay, look, this guy that whose initials are still on the Bears uniform, the GSH.
Right.
I'm not saying that this guy was racist. I'm just saying that in terms of the historical changes that we've seen in society, he could have been a bigger part of it, and he was more of a follower as opposed to a leader. That's kind of a bit what I got, or just because it takes a lot to sort of do something, and maybe I'm way off in this. I'm just thinking of another Chicagoan in Barack Obama that I've been thinking about lately. Like 12 years ago or 13 years ago, during the Democratic primary, he was anti-gay marriage.
Yeah,
and they all were. And this is not saying that. And Obama's later said that it was something that I didn't want to say, and I believe it. I remember watching that, thinking, "Shit, this guy's lying. He's saying what he thinks he's got to say."
Yeah.
So does that make him a follower at that point? I guess to a point, yes. But for the greater good, history looks at him kindly for what he eventually did for gay and trans rights.
All right, so
and I don't know. I'm just throwing this out because I want to know more about Halas.
I'm with you. So the challenge here, of course, is that one of the challenges of reading history and trying to reach certain conclusions based on your critical thought, based on what you read, and what you read includes what people say. And I read a lot of old newspapers, and so there's a lot of old quotes, is that you, to a certain degree, have to follow your best intuition. There's no definitive George Halas. There's no like secret tapes of like George Halas saying the N-word or using slurs. So I think that people oftentimes, or I think that white people oftentimes think of racism as a direct action that we identify as like animosity and rudeness and anger and hatred in a direct, tangible manner focused against another individual. And that's bad. But that's not the totality of racism, and in a respect, that's a very small piece of it. I very purposefully did not say in that piece George Halas is or is not a racist. That might be a separate discussion, and it might be an irrelevant discussion. What is true is that George Halas enacted racist policies.
Right.
And I don't feel comfortable, and I wouldn't ever, and I know that you're asking a question, so I'm not saying you're saying this, but I would not call him a follower because he clearly showed himself in every respect to be a leader.
No, I understand. I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Whether or not he came up with the idea for the ban, and as I showed in the piece, and as another historian, Neil Rosendahl, had pointed out as well, that there was this stark decline of black players in the league prior to the actual start of the ban. And then you can parse out the reasons why that was happening. But the point is that it doesn't matter if it was George Halas's idea. All that matters is that he was a leader of the league. I don't find it plausible to think that he didn't sign off on it at the outset, because everything that happened in the league happened with his tacit approval. And he even, if he thought a rule was going to go against him, he would be very vocal in pushing back upon that. So I would never call him a follower in that respect. And it doesn't matter if it was his idea to begin with or he signed off on it. He was
still part of it.
He was the biggest voice in the room. He's the biggest figure in the league. He wasn't the league commissioner, but decisions weren't made without George Halas.
Right.
And he then participated in it for 12 years. Additionally, the Bears hadn't had a black player to that point.
Who was their first black player? I'm actually not sure on that.
Eddie Macon, 1952.
Okay. Oh, so it took until 52.
Took him until 52. And we drafted George Taliaferro.
I read your piece on that, yeah.
Yeah, so...
Can you tell everyone about that?
So the Bears in 1948 drafted George Taliaferro out of Indiana University, and he was, the positions at the time are a little bit muddled, like what a quarterback was.
Yeah, in the late 40s, definitely.
So
yes.
It's a little bit trickier. It's a little bit trickier to say. Excuse me, drafted in 1949. And that's partially because 1950 was the year that the NFL enacted the free substitution rule, which is what created offense and defense. Like players who played offense and played defense, as opposed to guys going both ways. So it's always a little bit trickier with some of these position designations, even though obviously there were guys who were defining the quarterback role as we know it. Prior to that, Sammy Baugh, certainly Sid Luckman. But Taliaferro was the first black player drafted by an NFL team. And this is why I'm looking at now. This is why I have 48 in my head, because the 1949 draft was held in December of 48.
Right.
So he was the first black player drafted by an NFL team. The Bears selected him. The Bears did not sign him. He signed with the Los Angeles Dons of the All-American Football Conference. And then the Bears' first black player wasn't until 3 seasons later with Eddie Macon. So the Bears went their first 32 years of existence without a black player. The ban is only 12 years in the middle of that. So again, some people say that George Halas hated black people or acted aggressively toward them. I don't have any reason to think that they're wrong. That, though, is always a more difficult piece to parse out when it's just talking about what someone said. And what I'm saying is that I don't think we need necessarily to hem and haw about what's true, what's not. We know what's true. George Halas was the leader of the NFL, during which time his team didn't have any black players and the league didn't have any black players. And the explanations he gave in years later as to why that happened don't make any sense and don't hold up when you look at what was actually going on.
And a lot of which you've sort of illustrated in that piece. I just want to sort of like segue from that, and I certainly want you to promote everything that where everyone can sort of see some of your writing. You're working on a book now that I really wanted to talk to you about. About an era that I don't think anyone can get enough of.
That we've learned that is true.
Yeah, and that is the Chicago Bulls dynasty. I believe you're titling it 6 Rings.
I am.
All right, so please tell me about that. I just know that from your Twitter bio. We've never actually spoke about this, so I really want to learn about what you're working on.
So this kind of ties into the question earlier about how did I become a historian or officially a sports historian, and the idea around branding. And, I was an MJ kid. I was a Bulls kid. I mean, I was more of a Cliff Livingston. I always liked the underdog. So I was all about Cliff Livingston and Craig Hodges and BJ, and then the second three-peat. I loved Judd Bushler. I was a big Dennis Rodman guy because I like underdogs. I like weirdos.
So that's where we get along.
Yeah, definitely. And I like anyone who wears number 6. So those were those were some of my ways to choose a favorite. So at a certain point, again, it just became clear to me in the past decade, I guess, that the Bulls topic and the MJ topic wasn't fading. And in fact, the better that LeBron got, and when Kobe got into his run of being a champion without Shaquille, between those two guys, there was going to be a lot of MJ talk. And it just became clear to me that I was equipped to talk MJ and talk Bulls in a way that few others could. And I may as well embrace that and do it. So I feel like I picked up even more than in 2005. I wrote a book unpublished, and there was a lot of dynasty stuff in there. But I feel like my dynasty heavy stuff popped up as I worked more into my professional portion of my sports writing career, starting in 2011, 2012, and the impetus for this was realizing, number one, that I should write a book. Having written this piece in 2005, there was a book. I wrote a book about Obama in 2009, 2010. I wrote a ebook, or a shorter book, or whatever. It's free online about the '96 Bulls. And I got a lot of play off of that. I was able to do a lot of radio and TV and podcasts off of that. It just became clear that, all right, you got to, sit down and do something full. And it struck me that there was no book about the dynasty. There were only books about individual pieces. There's biographies on Jordan. There are autobiographies. Phil's got a couple of books that touch on the '90s Bulls. And, Sacred Hoops was, I think, published in '96. So that's got everything up to '96. He's got his 11 rings, but that's his entire autobiography. There's, a big portion of that book obviously is about the Lakers. So then you've got Rodman's books. Bill Wennington wrote a book. Luke Longley wrote a book. There were the books by Roland Lansonby about specific seasons, Rick Tellender about specific seasons, but Melissa Isaacson about specific seasons. But there wasn't a book about the whole run. And additionally, the Bulls dynasty, as I like to say, it was global and it was hyper-local. So we were impacting, global trends. And there were always stories, and then I found them since then, of, kids in all sorts of other countries, in other continents, who would say, Michael Jordan's the most famous man on earth. Michael Jordan's the most influential man on earth. And anywhere you go in the world, you still see people in MJ jerseys and in Bulls gear. And then, of course, we were a national story. We were driving culture in the United States. The rise of wearing sports gear coincides with the rise of MJ, because David Stern wanted to individualize the league. Magic, Doc, Bird, Isaiah, and then Michael was he took that next level. And he's in commercials and selling all sorts of products and movies. I'm not saying anything anybody doesn't know. But the Bulls were also hyper-local. And everything in the Chicagoland area and everything basically in Illinois from 87 to 98 probably and beyond, but certainly in those years, everything was infused with the Bulls. You go into school, in your school library, and there would be a reading contest, and you'd win a Bulls basketball. Or the Empire Carpet guy, that's a local business. Everybody in Illinois knows 588-2300 Empire, and he gives away Michael Jordan, your signed Michael Jordan basketball. The Bulls played, in the city but their practice facility was in Deerfield. So depending on where you lived, you might have run-ins with players in one place or the other. You know, MJ would go and play in pickup games on, on the far south side and different parks, west side, but then you might also run into him at the McDonald's on 41 and whatever that is, like 41 and Half Day Road up north, way north. You know, your uncle sells a car. I always say, like, your uncle sells a car to, like, Bill Wennington, and that's like a family story for years. And you know, someone would come, Steve Kerr would come to your school and tell you about the importance of reading. Or there was stories that, like, when Doug Collins was the coach, that Chris Collins, I feel like I've heard this so much, I'm not even sure if it's true or an urban legend or whatever, but that Chris Collins, who now, you know, coaches Northwestern, that Chris Collins, for show and tell, brought Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant to his school as his show and tell. Ray Clay, the PA announcer during the championship years. And now the starting lineup, that guy. Mm-hmm. People would hire him to announce their kid's bar mitzvah. So when there were all these lavish bar and bat mitzvah parties in the 1990s on the North Shore in the suburbs, and you have these parties and there's an MC and you introduce the kid, welcome to, you know, Ben Schwartzstein. They would hire Ray Clay to announce.
Please tell me though that they were also doing Sirius in the back.
I'm sure they would. I didn't get invited to any of those bar mitzvahs. I just want to make that clear. But,
okay. So you weren't one of the cool kids, is what you're telling me.
I wasn't one of the rich kids.
But cool. Okay, never. My bad. I was neither cool nor rich.
I wasn't cool either. I was just me. But the point is that wherever you were, certainly in Chicago, in the greater Chicagoland area, your suburbs, your downstate, anywhere in Illinois, I say anywhere between, you know, Gary and Kenosha, and anywhere between Indianapolis and St. Louis, the Bulls had a very personal way that they impacted your day-to-day life. They were our clothing. And they were our music. And they were the best possible gift that your parents could get you, was something about the Bulls. Bulls tickets, a Bulls jersey, a Bulls blanket, a Bulls basketball. And I did a thread over Christmas where I just looked in newspapers.com for kids, because newspapers would publish kids' letters to Santa. And I just looked for letters of kids asking Santa for Bulls stuff. So my book aims to tell the story of the dynasty from a basketball standpoint and also from a culture and social standpoint, from the global to the national to the very, very local. So, for example, I did and to support – so then the other piece is that when I'm writing something long, I get all these tidbits and I want to share them with people, but then I don't want to bore people because, as everybody can tell, I talk and talk and talk. Especially when I'm geeked. And so I started a newsletter, readjack.substack.com, and I am putting all my research as I get it into the newsletter. So it just became a way to make sure, number one, that I'm writing and working on the book, and that I don't have this buildup, that I feel like I can share it, but I'm not blasting it on Twitter. I'm not calling my friends. I know that I'm not boring people because they have signed up to get these newsletters and in some cases paid to get them. So, for example, there was an interview with a guy named Chris Mott, who was a Bulls ball boy in the dynasty years. And he was on Oprah in 1996 or 97. He popped up in a Sports Illustrated story that Rick Riley wrote in 98. And he was invited to Scottie Pippen and Larsa's wedding, and we linked up on Twitter, and he just has such a cool story, and it's very personalized, and it's very local, and, you know, driving to games from his house in the suburbs. And I've got one coming up with Jim Irwin, who ran sound at the stadium.
Mm-hmm.
And he has the original tape decks, the tape deck tapes of Sirius.
Yeah, that song, yep.
And of Rock and Roll Part 2. That's the Gary Glitter song. Dun, 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 dun,
Hey!
dun, dun. So they used it in Joker, and it sort of like re-blew up, and then it turns out Gary Glitter's a child molester or something, and so people are like, so there was like conversation about that.
Not everyone's perfect.
Jesus. But yeah, so this guy, Jim Irwin, has those original tapes. He showed me, and this is one I haven't published yet, but it's coming. He showed me his stadium badge for Game 6 of the 92 finals, which we won against Portland.
Yeah.
And, hold on. And his stadium badge for the never played Game 7 of the 92 finals. Because at the time when the finals were 2-3-2, we had the last 2 games at the barn, and they gave all of the stadium employees and anybody who had a media pass or a badge, like a stadium credential, they gave them Game 6 and Game 7 together because they were back-to-back nights. So we didn't play Game 7, obviously. We won the championship in Game 6, but he showed me his pictures of his badge for Game 6 and of Game 7. Everybody in the Chicagoland area remembers getting their championship gear at Carson Peary Scott, which was, they had this exclusive merch deal with the Bulls, this department store, Carson Peary Scott. And I tracked down the head of promotions at that time, a man named John Beecham, and interviewed him a couple weeks ago. That story's to come. He was a Chicagoan, and he was working for the company, which was had strong Milwaukee ties, and they had just been acquired by another company. They were worried about fading away. It was his idea to go to the Bulls and establish an exclusive merch deal, so that the Bulls, all their championship shirts, had to go to Carson Peary Scott first before they would go to any other department store. So there are people my age, who remember as kids going to Carson Peary Scott on the day after the Bulls won a championship and waiting to buy the T-shirts there. This guy Beecham was also, as he tells it, the person who came up with the idea of having a Bulls section in a department store. So previously you would go to a department store and you would get your sports gear in whatever relevant section it was. So the children's section, the boys section, the men's section, the sporting goods section. And he was like, we just need a Bulls section.
Wow.
And that was the reason that then you walk into a department store now and it's like, this is where you shop for your fishing gear, and this is where you shop for your activewear, and this is where you shop for your Bull stuff. So it's all these personalized, individual, very local stories that everyone in Chicago has, and everybody in the suburbs has, and everybody downstate has. And I don't think you can tell the story of the Bulls without telling the story of the impact that the Bulls had on everything, on food, on McDonald's, on clothing, on books, on styles, on culture, on music, on TV, on film, everything. So that's what the book is. It's coming slowly but surely. And you can get all sorts of cool stuff, cool updates, and cool pieces on readjack.substack.com. As I like to say, it costs PAX in a month or PIP in a year.
and where can everyone follow you on Twitter?
At readjack, READJACK.
Okay. I want to close off by saying thank you on something that you actually did for me indirectly without maybe realizing it.
Okay.
The United States Athletic Hall of Fame is something that Evan Nolan, my regular partner on the Hall of Fame show that we do on NotHallOfFame.com, do.
Yes.
We don't even know which one of us came up with the idea. Might have been him, might have been me. Selfishly, I'm going to say probably me, but maybe not. But there is no U.S. Athletic Hall of Fame, so we have trademarked it. It's going to be launching in a couple weeks. You're part of it. I hope you're going to be a bigger part of it moving forward.
Yes.
With the committee that we've put together, which has former NFL legend, former Olympians, and just a pretty diverse group, which was important.
It's a really cool group.
Thank you. And that was really important to Evan and I to make sure that we had something that reflected that, which is interesting considering the fact that I'm a Canadian living in Barbados.
Right.
But I'm obsessed with American sports. But when I asked you to be a part of it, and I don't remember at what point it is you asked me this, you asked me, what do I want it to be? I didn't know the answer. And I thought about it. I have an answer for you now that I don't think I sent to you on Twitter when you asked me that. And it's going to be whatever somebody thinks it's going to be. For me personally, I have a love affair with American sports as a Canadian growing up, being a little bit insecure about my own country, which I'm embarrassed about now, but that's how it was.
Okay.
Because I'm about 10, 11 years older than you. I think.
Impossible. It's impossible.
Well, it's because of my youthful appearance, I know. But
there you go.
But I'm just old enough to remember the debacle of the 1976 Olympics in Montreal.
Okay.
Where in Canada, want to know how many gold medals we won?
I don't know that I do. How many?
Close your eyes. What do you see?
Oh, that's a bummer.
Yeah. So Canadian sports essentially was living off the glory of the 1972 Summit Series against the Soviet Union.
Okay.
Which was our Miracle on Ice.
Okay.
Which means a lot to Canada, but to no one else. Anyway, incorrectly, I think, in my youth, I looked towards the U.S. as my validation for things. So when I look at the United States, I have a bit of a love-hate thing. I love what I think the United States can be and what it should be based on how it was originated. Having said that, when people look at U.S. sports now, in the United States as it is, they have a lot of different opinions on that. So for me, is this a very political thing that I've created or I've co-created? Yes or no?
Right.
If you say it is, then yes. If you say it is, then no. There's not a wrong thing. The way I'm viewing this, the United States Athletic Hall of Fame, it's what you want it to be.
Okay.
And I had to think about that when you asked me, what do I want? And I don't know what I want. I know what it is to me, and what it is to me might be different than it is for you, might be different than it is for the people voting on this. I don't know how it's going to move forward. I have no clue.
Yeah.
All I know is that I want it to be the most interactive, with the most impact, with the most valued input as possible. So
that you've done for sure.
Yeah, and one thing that we talked about. So that's going to launch in a couple weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks from at the time you and I are talking, and what I wanted it to have is sort of feel very American, yet at the same time not celebrating some of the things that aren't celebrated in the United States. And again, I don't know. And so when people say, hey, you're not an American, what the hell do you know? Hey, you know what? You're right. I'm a fanboy. I'll tell you that. I'm a fanboy when it comes to American sports. I know that. I get it. It is what it is.
Yeah.
So every year we want it to have, like, the announcements sort of happen on Juneteenth.
Okay.
And that was actually my idea.
Yep.
And which was sort of corroborated by the group that I have, which again is a diverse group, as you've seen. You're part of that. So you know that it is.
I agree.
Yeah, and it's half selfish and half American. because I say half selfish because, to my knowledge, and you're the historian, you can tell me this, I don't think that there's any sports thing associated with Juneteenth. I can't think of one.
I don't know of one, but I that doesn't mean it's not there.
No, exactly. So
yeah.
I wanted that moving forward, and then I also wanted something that I thought was celebrating, which is a future American holiday, which is predominantly with a lot of nominees who are going to be African American. So, again, when you ask me, what do I want this to be? Here's my answer. Finally, my official answer. Whatever all of you think it is. This is what it is to me. If you want to make it super political, great. If you don't, that's great too. You're right also. There's not a wrong answer. And I hope we all sort of celebrate a country that maybe not sort of, no country's perfect. I mean, look, I have a prime minister who wore blackface at a canoe trip and thought it was a great idea.
Yeah. Oh, jeez, I forgot about that.
I have not. I did a whole rant. Exactly. I did a whole rant on that on my show last night.
Okay.
On how I cannot stand the guy. But anyway.
Okay.
There's not a wrong thing. So I want it to be inclusive for everyone, not just by race, but by politics. You want to be far right? Okay, I may not agree with you, but this is your Hall of Fame too. You want to be far left? I may not agree with you. That's okay. This is your Hall of Fame too. This is about American sports. What does it mean to you? And you're not wrong.
Very good.
So I want to thank you for that because you made me think about that earlier, and I should have thought of it before, and I didn't. But thank you.
Yeah, well, thank Charles Silverstein for always saying, what is it? How does it work? Put it in a box.
I'd thank my dad, but he just said, "What are you doing, dumbass?" And I love him just as much. Don't get me wrong.
There you go.
I love Peter Buckner. Peter Buckner is a great guy.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Peter.
All right. Thanks so much. And Jack, I really enjoy this. I've actually really enjoyed getting to know you more through this. And I encourage everyone to sort of follow you on Twitter. And when you have that book out, please come back. I want to help promote it. I want to help talk about it. And I want to read it.
I want to write it. I mean, it's coming. It's going slowly. But that's also why I like the newsletter, because at least there is progress that can be seen and that can be talked about. And one of my favorite pieces that I wrote for the newsletter is that I looked at Jerry Krause's career prior to him becoming the Bulls GM in 1985. And Jerry Krause is just one of the most fascinating careers in sports that I've ever seen. And he had 2 stints with the Bulls prior to the stint that we all know. And it gave a little bit more context to why he was the way he was. And I don't know, it was really cool. So there's a lot of good stuff on there. Readjack.substack.com. And I might raise the prices at some point, but right now we're rocking with Pippen a year, Pax in a month. And if you know what that means, this newsletter is for you. And if you don't know what that means,
this newsletter is still for you.
Might still be for you, but definitely if you know what that means, then it is for you.
All right, thanks so much, Jack. Thank you all so much for listening. There's going to be a lot more content from us regularly at notinhalloffame.com. Stay tuned, everyone, and stay safe. And stay safe. And stay safe. And stay safe. And stay